Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. India is headed to lead the G20 countries from the position of strength and will leave a mark on the world for years to come during its next year's presidency. IMF's Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said this on Thursday. In an endorsement of the country's economic trajectory, she said India deserves to be called a bright spot on this otherwise darker horizon. Even though the IMF has cut India's growth prospects to 6.8% in its latest World Economic Outlook, down from 7.4% in its July outlook, India stands out at a time when global growth is projected to slow down from 6% in 2021 to 3.2% in 2022. So as India takes over the presidency of the G20 in December this year, the IMF MD expressed optimism, saying from its position of strength, India will be leaving a mark on the world for several years to come. What kind of mark is India expected to bring about? What are some of the structural reforms that have brought India to this position of strength about which the IMF MD spoke about? Also, how is India bracing itself for the G20 presidency? This and much more in perspective today with an illustrious panel of experts joining me on the program. Pleased to welcome Ms. Elizabeth Braw, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute, London, former Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, and Dr. Sriram Cholia, Foreign Affairs expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today. Dr. Cholia, before we delve deeper into the opportunities and the aspirations for India as G20 chair, let me get your perspective on what the IMF MD has said. It's sort of an endorsing view about India's growth trajectory. What, according to you, have been some of the highlights, some of the critical factors that have brought India today to this position of strength and which have also raised expectations of the world in terms of helping other countries, in terms of leaving a mark behind as G20 chair?
Tina, first of all, I think the fiscal management was much superior. And during the pandemic, the country that is saying we should spend 10% of GDP on stimulus packages and all that. But actually, the way Narendra Modi government handled the finances, we are a lot more stable. You see so many countries falling apart under the pressure of this ongoing energy, food, and financial crisis. But India is very stable. And I think the management, macroeconomic management through the crisis period, last 2.5, 3 years, despite the lockdowns and all that, was tremendous. So that's what is giving us this position of strength the IMF chief is talking about. The second, of course, is the digitization and major reforms that we have done with regard to financial inclusion. So a lot more people are now beneficiaries of government schemes. The level of corruption has been reduced to a great extent. So there are a lot of, I think, fundamental reforms that we have done, and also unleashing the entrepreneurial spirits, the startup culture. You see, the pace at which these things are happening, it's a ray of hope for the world. And on the diplomatic front also, I think not just IMF, but the entire G20, what they're expecting is that India will act as a big unifying force, because we have the world divided into multiple camps, especially over the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a lot of tension, and there have been G20 preparatory summits to the Indonesia summit this year, where some ministers have walked out when the Russian minister has been talking. Then there's even a fear there will be no joint declaration, which would be a disaster. So I think India quietly is working as part of the Troika along with Indonesia, which is the current host, and Italy, which was last year's host. And we are actually working towards making sure there is unity and unanimity and consensus on core issues that matter. And India has, of course, a long list of priorities. It's going to come in with a lot of developmental agenda of its own once we take over the presidency. But I think the overall positivity stems from this dual factor that we are strong domestically, economically doing very well, relatively speaking. And secondly, we are constructive and building bridges to make sure G20 stays together.
Ambassador, do you agree that at a time when, the world is clearly divided, geopolitics is constantly changing, India has consistently maintained its independent foreign policy, and perhaps that's what has earned it the kind of hope that the other countries now have of India acting as a global diplomat. Do you think that somewhere is also working in favor of India? And the other part of the question is, what are some of the critical issues that you think India is going to bring on the table when it begins its presidency of the G20 in December?
As you mentioned, what are the factors which make India eminently suited to head the G20 at this time when the world is so divided. Now, let me mention that although the G20 is an economic grouping, it is inevitably impacted by global political developments. And as you said, the world is a divided house at the moment. Now, India's standing, not just in the G20, but on the entire international scenario, has been enhanced by its independent foreign policy. Our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, recently pointed out that the world has noted India's independent stance in the Ukraine conflict, and that this independent stance has resulted in a brand improvement owing to the stronger confidence and the more independent voice with which we have spoken out on global issues. We have made our decisions on these issues in a very independent fashion. So, at a time when the world was facing the challenges on account of the Ukraine Russia war, on account of Chinese expansionism, at such troubled times, India's independent foreign policy has made a mark and propelled it towards the sort of leadership role which the G20 really needs at this particular time.
All right.
Now, let me mention, by way of some introductory remarks, that the G20 or the Group of 20 is an intergovernmental forum of the world's major developed and developing economies. And while it comprises 19 countries and the European Union, collectively, the G20 accounts for 85% of the global GDP, 75% of international trade, and two-thirds of the world's population. Therefore, it is the most important forum for international economic cooperation. India will naturally bring a number of important issues to the table, and many of these were highlighted in the briefing of the External Affairs Ministry. Well, there are issues which range from health, agriculture, and education to commerce, skill mapping, culture, tourism, climate financing, global food security, which has become very important in the present times, energy security, green hydrogen, disaster risk reduction. So all these are important global challenges which India is well equipped to handle on behalf of the G20.
That's right, Ambassador.
And that is why the IMF managing director, the IMF chief, said that India will leave a mark as G20 chairman. Of course, she highlighted a number of facts which also bear repetition. Let me mention that she said that India deserves to be called a bright spot on this otherwise dark horizon because it has been a fast-growing economy even during these difficult times. So India will lead by example. At a time when the world is facing difficulty, India has steered clear of the major difficulties and managed to register an important growth rate.
That's right.
Again, as she pointed out, India's growth is backed by structural reforms, which the developing countries and other countries need to learn from. Then, as she pointed out, there has been a remarkable success of digitalization in India, and that the digital identity that provides services and support on the basis of digital access is the remarkable success of India. Others can emulate.
That's true,
And of
Ambassador.
course,
That's an
turning to
important
renewable
point that you've
energy, she
made.
said that India has
The
really
fact-
leapfrogged
the
in
fact
terms
that,
of
you know,
solar and
India-
other forms of renewable energy. So
that's-
these are the major issues, and India's global leadership on such important issues has been noticed and highlighted by important people like the IMF chief. And I
Absolutely.
think India is well poised to lead the G20.
Absolutely, Ambassador. So, a host of issues that you have cited for us and our viewers that India will definitely bring to the table. But I want to take the point of global challenges that you mentioned to Ms. Bro. The fact that, this G20 presidency that India is going to hold comes at a time when the world is facing a lot of challenges, both on the political as well as the economic front. And perhaps because this grouping, this forum, its strength is that it comprises of all the major developed and developing economies, and they together have to find pragmatic solutions to some of these contemporary problems. What are the expectations from this 1 year when India is going to hold the chair, hold the presidency, considering the fact that India has steered well through the challenges of COVID pandemic, even in this geopolitical crisis, India has stood out. So in terms of that, in this 1 year, the kind of expectations that you see from the G20?
Well, Tina, I think expectations on the G20 are low simply because there are so many countries that don't get along are members of it at the same time. But for India, as the upcoming chair, there are clearly opportunities to profile itself as not just an emerging economic power, but one that's managing to address its various structural issues that the other speakers have addressed, including vast amounts of bureaucracy, which is one complaint one always hears from international companies wanting to expand their operations in India. But so from that perspective, there is a lot of opportunity. Also, maybe there are opportunities for diplomacy to at least get representatives or leaders of these various countries in the same room. The big challenge, though, Tina, is that the Ukraine war is still continuing all these months after Russia invaded. And while India may not want to take a position on the war as such, it is a drag on the global economy, as we all know, and it has caused rising energy prices, which is a big concern in Europe. Of course, as we know. And so as long as that war continues, it will be a drag on the global economy and the prospects of all the members of the G20, regardless of their position on the war in Ukraine. So I think it would be in everybody's interest for the war to end soon. But then one last point on India's opportunities within G20. Now really is India's moment to try to position itself as an alternative location for companies that are now deciding that it's a good idea to reduce their footprint in China, both for sales and for manufacturing, and they are all looking to India. So clearly, that's not something that's settled within the G20, but India can use its platform within the G20 to highlight that it is a stable country. It's a country where Western companies don't have to worry about politically motivated interference with their operations, which is their concern in China. And so as long as the reforms that were previously mentioned continue, I think this is a major opportunity for India to attract those companies that are now leaving China. Apple has, for example, already moved its iPad production to China, and I think also the smartwatch.
That's true. I mean, wherever there are opportunities, Professor Cholia, there are also challenges. And one big challenge for India is going to be, apart from bringing a host of issues, the fact that what Ambassador was mentioning, that it's a divided world today. And to synthesize divergent views as being the chair is going to be a difficult task, isn't it?
Yeah, especially there are two divergences. One is the political divisions and the geopolitical, contestation you're seeing among the major powers in different parts of the world. And the second is, whenever there is a large-scale global recession or downturn, then each country tries to go its own way when it comes to solutions. And G20 was initially created way back in 2009 to address this problem and to create some kind of a coordination among all the major economies, keeping in mind that there is a single global economy. So to make sure both of these parallel tracks, which of course also intersect at some point, the political and the economic, that there is not so much fractiousness that we don't really have any solutions at all. I think that's the big challenge for India. And our, Sherpas and our representatives, that's why we are holding so many consultative meetings. Our plan is to hold 200 or more. And, there are many smaller mechanisms within G20, like the Youth 20, the L20 labor unions, the think tanks, all of these. India is actually outdoing all the previous hosts in terms of organizing more and more gatherings and collecting opinions, because there is also perception, especially among those who are not part of G20. Remember, there are 173, or actually 174 nation states which are not part of G20. The G20 is 19 countries plus EU. So these 174 should not also be left behind. That's why there is something called outreach groups. So we are now planning to invite a range of other developing countries from various continents to be there in Delhi next year when we are hosting the G20, so that they don't feel left out and they don't feel like these are just the major economies and they have a selfish agenda and that they don't want to share. So India's strength really is to voice the LDCs, as we call least developed countries, small island developing countries. That is our strength, and we are going to make sure their interests are not trampled upon by selfish motivations of anybody. I mean, if this war continues, I mean, there are some who are saying that we will only stop the war when Russia is defeated. But if that is the case, this is going to last forever, or probably for several months, several more months or years. So I think the position of least developed countries, which India is also voicing, is we need to stop this. Otherwise, the repercussions are so huge. We're talking about, yes, there has been mass tragedy in Europe, but it could be amplified multiple times with hundreds of millions of people not being able to put food on the table or to survive this coming crisis. So I think we are going to bring in that element also to say, look at the larger picture. We are 7 billion people on this planet, and everyone is suffering from this war. It's not just the Ukrainians. So we need to make sure that there is a solution that comes in which addresses these larger planetary problems that we are facing. And that is where I think India's strength, traditionally, our multilateral diplomacy is based on that, to bring along large groups and to find common ground. So I'm pretty sure the baton, as it's handed over from Indonesia to India, it's two big developing countries, one after the other, who are going to handle G20 affairs. So I think that's a positive sign in terms of timing also, that we are going in with a clear agenda for the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals are really under threat.
Yes.
Since the pandemic began, and now with this new recession and the war, there's no hope at all that any of these major goals like poverty reduction and gender equality, all these will be met. We are all regressing actually as a result of these cascading crises. So how to stop this regression, how to put a floor under this fall, the free fall that is happening, and how to revive the global economy in a fair and equitable manner, I think that is ultimately the test. So these are the big challenges, and we are up for it. And I think Prime Minister's leadership is going to be critical, because while we have a whole infrastructure and paraphernalia, all the ministries, everyone is now out there on the field working on G20 substructures, ultimately top leadership and breaking the log jams, making sure key people talk to other key people and being there. I think India has a huge role as a facilitator, if not a mediator, for these global crises to be managed.
Yes, that's right, Ambassador. So, the way forward for India is to not just have an inclusive approach, but also a sustainable one. Because what we've seen post-pandemic and because of the Ukraine-Russia war, all of these geopolitical crises have taken center stage. The Sustainable Development Goals have been left behind, as Dr. Cholia said. But also, it's going to be a test for India's diplomatic acumen. Now, India has this challenge to, reconcile multiple viewpoints of rivals, of adversaries, of allies, and most importantly, to, include the voice of the global South. And this is where the thrust has been of our leadership, of our External Affairs Minister, that India promotes multilateralism. And for this, restructuring of the existing multilateral bodies is the need of the hour. So do you think that is something that India is going to prominently bring up during its G20 presidency?
Yes, certainly. Multilateral reforms have been a very important plank of our foreign policy. And I have no doubt that during the deliberations of the G20 during our presidency, we will focus on the need for very, very comprehensive multilateral reforms, because without such reforms, the imbroglio which the world is facing will continue to be there. As Professor Cholia said, the Ukraine-Russia conflict could just continue because there is no international force which is being brought to bear in a very, very concerted manner on ending the conflict. India has been calling for dialogue, diplomacy, and a recourse only to these can end the war. But I'm afraid that the world is such a divided house that the right course has not been adopted. Now, during India's presidency of the G20, it will have a very important opportunity to drive home its objectives and to provide a leadership on all these matters in the direction that it wants to. So I think that this opportunity which is being provided is very important for the world and for the developing nations in particular, which are very, very adversely impacted. Now, I may also mention that under India's presidency, the Troika would comprise India, Indonesia, and Brazil. All three are developing countries. All three are fully aware of the challenges which are being faced in the current scenario by particularly the developing countries, which are bearing the brunt of the global energy crisis or the global food shortage because they have a resource crunch. So India is well poised to take up all these issues on behalf of the developing countries, and it is significant that it is invited as guest countries some other very important partners in the developing world, such as Bangladesh, Egypt, Mauritius, Nigeria, Oman, and UAE. Of course, it has also invited the Netherlands, Singapore, and Spain, which are on the developed side. But the idea is to make it a very comprehensive platform, and India is exerting efforts in that direction, also highlighting some important global challenges, such as by inviting the International Solar Alliance or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure or the Asian Development Bank. These have been invited as guest international organizations. So by holding the presidency, India has a very, very good chance of steering the course of the world through this very, very difficult period and providing leadership, which it is eminently suited to provide.
Okay. Ms. Bro, time allows me to take up very quickly one last question from you. The fact that challenges to the global economy today are stark, huge, they're impacting, especially the lesser developing countries, the emerging economies particularly, and the G20, because it has significant influence in the political and economic spheres. Do you think the GDP can have some kind of approach to actually help the global growth? And which is inclusive, number one, and which is sustainable, that's in the longer run for the benefit of all of us, for humankind, and for the planet, most importantly?
We are seeing a massive shift, really, in how companies are thinking about their operations. And I can't tell you how radical the shift has been in how they view China in particular. They are so concerned about politically motivated repercussions against them in China, or the political risk of doing business in China, that they are urgently looking for, looking to shift their supply chains to other countries. And India is obviously seeing the results of some of that, because they're moving production to India, a number of companies are, and also to Vietnam. But I think as the geopolitical tensions continue to intensify, this is actually maybe an unexpectedly good development for developing countries, because they will be able to position themselves as alternative locations for manufacturing for a number of countries. I'm not saying that China can be replaced by a string of developing countries, but partially they can pick up some of that that interest that global companies have in shifting their supply chains, and we're already seeing so much of it in Southeast Asia. I think it can move to other countries. That interest and investment can move to other countries as well, because China is no longer that sort of nirvana of the globalized economy. And as this development is happening, companies will have to take into account that sustainability really is a major concern. Maybe not for them individually, but for consumers around the world, and investors and shareholders and boards. So it's no longer enough to greenwash and say you're putting your ESG report that you're interested in, or you're paying attention to sustainability. You really have to be serious about it, because people are watching.
That's right. So the bottom line is that India inherits a presidency that's full of challenges, as our panelists have underlined. But as Dr. Choliya also rightly said, we have risen to the occasion in the past. Our diplomacy, the kind of foreign policy that we have adhered to over the last couple of years has helped India stand out, and we are ready to brace up this challenge as well when we take up the G20 presidency in December. It's for 1 year, so it's going to last till November 2023. More than 200 meetings will take place across the country over this period, wherein all of these important aspects that we have discussed will be taken up. Pragmatic solutions will be found to some of these contemporary global issues that are currently facing the leading economies as well as the lesser developed countries across the world. So we'll keep a track of what actually happens on all aspects related to G20. Do watch out this platform on Sunset TV. But for now, that's it from us on this edition of Perspective. I would like to thank all of our panelists once again for joining us on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. And thank you to you viewers as well for your time. I'll see you same time tomorrow now. Until then, you take good care of yourselves and keep watching Sunset.